The sun beat down on the dusty streets of Harmony Creek, a town clinging to existence in the heart of the Arizona Territory. The year was 1888, and the air was thick with the scent of dry earth, horse sweat, and the faint, coppery tang of recent violence. Sheriff Elias Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of weathered lines and unspoken burdens, stood on the porch of the town's only saloon, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The vibrant sky was a deceptive canvas of orange and pink, a beautiful lie hiding the harsh reality of their lives. A cold dread, heavier than any gun he'd ever held, settled in his stomach. Inside, his only son, 10-year-old Thomas, was burning with a fever that no doctor in the territory could break. Thomas's illness had come on suddenly, a swift and merciless thief stealing the light from his eyes. Dr. Albright, a man more accustomed to mending broken bones from bar fights than fighting unseen ailments, had shaken his head, sadly. "It's the fever, Elias, the desert fever. I've seen it before. It takes the young ones quick. There's not a thing to be done." Elias, a man who had faced down outlaws, rustlers, and blizzards without flinching, felt his world crumbling. His wife, Sarah, had died a year earlier, a casualty of a botched bank robbery. Thomas was all he had left, the last flickering candle in his dark world. He went through the motions of his job, breaking up a brawl, settling a land dispute, but his mind was a constant loop of Thomas's pale face and labored breathing. He looked at the town, the people he was sworn to protect, and saw only a collective blindness to his private anguish. They offered condolences, but their words were empty, a hollow echo in the vastness of his grief. As dusk began to paint the town in long shadows, Elias saw a familiar, small figure shuffling down the street. It was Lucas, a boy no older than Thomas, an orphan who had drifted into town 2 months ago. Lucas was an apparition of hardship, ragged clothes, bare feet caked in dust, and a face smudged with dirt. He was a silent, watchful shadow, begging for scraps outside the saloon and general store. The townspeople mostly ignored him, seeing him as little more than a nuisance. Elias, burdened by his own sorrows, had given him a few coins here and there, a small, almost subconscious act of empathy. He saw in the boy a mirror of his own loneliness. Lucas stopped a few feet from the saloon, his gaze, surprisingly intense for a child, fixed on Elias. He seemed to hesitate, his small hands clenching at his sides. The usual noise of the town, the clinking of glasses from the saloon, the creak of a wagon wheel, seemed to fade into the background. "Sheriff Thorne," Lucas said, his voice a whisper, but it carried an unexpected weight. Elias, lost in his thoughts, didn't immediately respond. The boy repeated his name a little louder this time. Elias finally turned, his eyes tired and distant. "What is it, son?" Lucas took a tentative step forward. I heard about your boy, Thomas." Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't want pity from anyone, least of all a beggar child. "The doctor says there's no hope," he stated, his voice flat, a wall of finality. "The doctor doesn't know everything," Lucas replied, his gaze unwavering. "My ma, she knew things. About the land, about the plants." He paused, his small frame trembling slightly. She saved me once from a fever like this. Said it was the ghost fire that lived in the blood. She used a special root." Elias felt a flash of anger, a surge of raw frustration. A beggar child offering him folk remedies? It was an insult to his despair, a cruel jab at his helplessness. "Son, I appreciate it, but you don't understand. This is a sickness, a real sickness. No magic roots are going to fix it." Lucas didn't flinch. "It's not magic, Sheriff. It's what grows in the desert. My ma said the desert takes life, but it also hides the way to save it. She had a saying, 'The cure grows in the same ground as the sickness.' I know where to find the root." Elias stared at the boy. There was something in his eyes, Not the usual desperation of a beggar, but a fierce, quiet certainty. It was the look of a person who had seen things, who had learned survival in a way that Elias, with all his guns and badges, couldn't comprehend. He saw the genuine, unvarnished concern on the boy's face. It was a stark contrast to the hollow condolences he'd received all day. A tiny, irrational flicker of hope, so small it was almost non-existent, sparked within him. He was a man of logic, a man who believed in hard facts and visible evidence. But Thomas was dying. The doctor had given up. What did he have to lose? "Where is it?" Elias asked, his voice low, a tremor betraying his carefully guarded composure. Lucas's face lit up with a fragile, hopeful smile. "Out past the dry riverbed near the Whispering Rocks. The root only grows where the cactus blooms purple." "The Whispering Rocks are an all-day ride," Elias said, the distance a stark reminder of the danger. "And it's getting dark. You're just a boy." "I know the way," Lucas insisted, his voice gaining a new strength. "I can take you there. We have to go now, before the sun is gone completely. The moon makes the root weak." Elias looked from the boy to the setting sun, its last rays painting the sky in a final, desperate burst of color. His heart, which had been a heavy, inert stone for days, began to beat with a new, frantic rhythm. He made a decision in that moment, one that went against every logical instinct he possessed. He was a father, and a father would grasp at the thinnest thread of possibility, even if it was offered by a ragged beggar boy. "Get on the back of my horse," Elias said, his voice a low command. Lucas, without a word, scrambled up behind him. As they rode out of town, leaving the dusty streets and the oblivious townsfolk behind, a new and different kind of dread settled in Elias's heart. He was putting his faith in a child, in a folk remedy, and in the unforgiving desert at night. The trail to the Whispering Rocks was a dangerous one, known for its sheer cliffs and rattlesnakes. But as he glanced back at Lucas, a small, determined figure clinging to his back, he felt a strange sense of companionship. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone in his fight. The dust was still thick in the air, but the shadow of despair, for a single, fleeting moment, seemed to lift. The journey was a blur of darkness and dust. The moon, a sliver of silver light, offered little help. Elias's horse, spurred on by his desperate hope, thundered across the unforgiving terrain. Lucas was an anchor on his back, his small arms wrapped tightly around Elias's waist. The cold desert night seeped into their bones. Elias's thoughts were a tangled mess of doubt and prayer. He was risking everything on a child's story, but the alternative, watching his son die, was a fate he couldn't bear. The landscape grew more treacherous. The flat, dusty plains gave way to a labyrinth of rocky outcroppings and narrow canyons. The air grew colder, and a sharp, biting wind whipped at their faces. Elias's horse, a seasoned trail animal, navigated the difficult terrain with a practiced ease, its hooves finding purchase on the loose stones. "It's here." Lucas's voice was a strained whisper against the wind. "The Whispering Rocks. See? They look like they're holding hands." Elias pulled the horse to a halt. In the dim moonlight, he saw a cluster of tall, worn rock formations, their shapes twisted and eerie. The wind whistled through the gaps, creating a low, mournful sound, as if the rocks themselves were whispering secrets. He dismounted, his legs stiff and sore. The air was still, heavy with a different kind of quiet. "The purple flowers," Lucas said, sliding off the horse. "They only bloom at night in the shadow of the rocks." Elias followed the boy, his hand on the hilt of his revolver, a reflex born of years of living in a dangerous land. Lucas, however, seemed completely at home. He moved with a quiet confidence, his bare feet silent on the rocky ground. He led Elias to a small crevice, hidden from plain sight. And there, against the dark earth, Elias saw them, small, almost invisible flowers with petals a deep, velvety purple, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "There," Lucas said, his voice full of a quiet triumph. "The flowers, the root is under them." Elias knelt down, his fingers brushing against the fragile petals. He was a man of the law, a man of violence, but in this moment he felt a strange, profound awe. He pulled out his knife and carefully dug into the hard earth. The root was small, gnarled and tough, its skin a dark brown. Lucas, with an expert touch, took the root, carefully scraped off the outer layer with a sharp stone, and crushed the inner pulp into a small makeshift poultice. "We have to go back now," Lucas said, urgency in his voice. "We have to get it to Thomas. The root, it loses its strength quickly." The ride back was even more frantic. The dawn was beginning to paint the sky in a soft grey, and Elias pushed the horse to its limits. He had the cure in his hands, a tiny, unassuming thing that held all his hopes. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drum against the silence of the desert. He saw the first signs of Harmony Creek in the distance, the familiar silhouette of the water tower, the faint glow of a lamp in a window. He was almost there. They arrived in Harmony Creek just as the sun broke over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the dusty street. Elias's horse was lathered in sweat, its flanks heaving. He jumped off, his legs shaky, and ran toward his house. Lucas, a small, determined figure running behind him. They burst through the door, the sound of their ragged breathing filling the quiet room. Thomas lay on his bed, his face pale and clammy, his breathing shallow and rapid. Elias's sister-in-law, Martha, a kind woman who had been watching over the boy, stood by his side, her face a mask of grief. She looked at Elias with a silent question in her eyes. "We found it," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "The root. Lucas found it." Martha looked at Lucas, a strange mix of skepticism and hope on her face. Lucas, however, didn't hesitate. He took the poultice and carefully pressed it against Thomas's forehead. "It will burn," he whispered to Elias. "But that's the fire leaving him. It's a good sign." Elias knelt by the bed, his hand trembling as he placed it on Thomas's forehead. It was still hot, but the frantic heat was replaced by a more bearable warmth. He watched as Lucas carefully applied a thin layer of the poultice to Thomas's temples and chest. The boy's feverish skin seemed to absorb the poultice, the dark paste a stark contrast against his pale skin. For hours they sat in silence, a vigil of hope. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its light filling the room. Elias watched Lucas, who sat on the floor, his head bowed, his small frame radiating a quiet strength. The boy wasn't just a beggar, he was a healer, a guide. He was a testament to the fact that even in the most desolate places, hope could be found. As the afternoon light streamed through the window, Thomas's breathing grew calmer. The color returned to his cheeks, and the frantic flutter of his eyelids settled. He was still weak, but the fever had broken. Elias, his heart full, felt a wave of profound relief wash over him. He looked at Lucas, his eyes filled with gratitude. You saved him," he whispered. Lucas looked up, his face smudged with dirt and fatigue, a small, weary smile on his face. "My ma was a good teacher," he said simply. Elias had a new mission now. He didn't just owe Lucas his son's life. He owed him a life of his own. He would not allow the boy to return to the streets. He stood up, his hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You're not a beggar anymore, son. You're family. You're coming home with us." The gratitude he felt was overwhelming, but it was also a promise. He had found a new purpose in life, to repay the debt he owed this small, courageous boy. The days that followed were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Thomas, weak but recovering, sat up in bed, his eyes clear and his voice regaining its strength. He and Lucas, two boys from different worlds, found common ground in their shared experience. They spoke of Thomas's favorite books and Lucas's knowledge of the desert, the names of the plants, the habits of the animals, the secrets of the landscape. Elias, meanwhile, was a man reborn. The weight of grief and helplessness had been lifted, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He bought Lucas new clothes, sturdy boots, and a warm jacket. He had him a bed set up in a spare room, a real bed, not the cold ground the boy was used to. The townspeople, who had watched Lucas's transformation with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, began to see him in a new light. He was no longer the beggar boy. He was the one who had saved the sheriff's son. During one of their long talks, Elias asked Lucas about his past. The boy was always vague, his eyes distant. He spoke of his mother, a gentle, wise woman, but never of a father. He would only say they had been traveling, that his mother had gotten sick, and that he had been on his own ever since. Elias didn't press him, sensing a deep-seated pain and a story the boy wasn't ready to tell. He simply offered his home, his protection, and his gratitude. One afternoon, as Lucas was showing Thomas how to identify different types of desert shrubs, a rider galloped into town. He was a tall, gaunt man with a face like chiseled granite, his eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his gaze sweeping over the town, a predatory stillness in his movements. The town instantly went quiet. This was not a traveller passing through. This was a hunter. Elias, standing on the porch of his office, felt a prickle of unease. He recognized the type, a man who had seen too much violence and carried it with him. The man's eyes finally settled on Lucas, who was still by the bushes, his face pale with fear. Lucas's body went rigid. His eyes, usually full of quiet wisdom, were wide with a terror that Elias had never seen before. "Uncle," the man said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He had no trace of a smile on his face. "It's time to come home." Elias froze. The term uncle was not what he expected. The man's gaze was not that of a concerned relative, but of a man laying claim to a possession. He was not here to offer comfort. He was here to take the boy. Lucas, however, was not moving. His small hands were clenched into fists, his body a silent testament to his defiance. "He's not coming with you," Elias said, his voice hard, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered revolver. The man turned his cold gaze on Elias. "He's family, and he belongs with family." Elias knew better than to believe him. He had seen the way the man looked at Lucas. It was not love, but a cruel form of ownership. He had a feeling that this man wasn't just here to take Lucas home, but to reclaim a piece of a life that Lucas had run away from. The standoff was tense, a silent promise of violence hanging in the air. The townsfolk, who had been watching with quiet curiosity, now took a step back, sensing the danger. The stranger, who introduced himself as Caleb, had a chilling calm about him. His every movement was deliberate, his eyes never leaving Elias. "I'm his uncle, Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "My sister, his mother, died. I'm here to take him in." Lucas, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. "You're a liar. You're not my uncle. My uncle is good." Caleb's face tightened with a flash of anger. "The boy is confused. He's been out on his own too long." Elias, however, wasn't swayed. He had seen the terror in Lucas's eyes, and he trusted his gut. "He's not going with you," he said, his hand slowly unholstering his gun. "He's staying with me." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "You're a fool, Sheriff. I'm taking him one way or another." The standoff escalated. Lucas, sensing the growing danger, took a step back, his eyes darting between Elias and Caleb. Elias was not just fighting for Lucas's freedom, he was fighting to keep his promise to the boy. He had vowed to protect him, and he would not fail. Just as Caleb's hand moved toward his own gun, A new voice rang out. It was Jedediah, the town's blacksmith, a large, gruff man with a heart of gold. "He ain't going nowhere," Jedediah said, stepping out from his shop, a heavy sledgehammer in his hand. "The boy saved the sheriff's son. He's a hero around here." The other townsfolk, emboldened by Jedediah's actions, began to gather. The saloon owner, the general store clerk, a few ranchers who had been in town, they all stood their ground, forming a silent wall of defiance. They had seen the change in Elias since Lucas's arrival. They had witnessed Thomas's recovery. They believed in the boy. Caleb looked at the crowd, his cold eyes calculating. He was outnumbered. He was a man of violence, but he was not a fool. He knew he couldn't take on an entire town. He let his hand drop from his gun. "This isn't over, Sheriff," he said, his voice a low promise. "He's mine, and I'll be back for him." He remounted his horse and rode out of town, a lingering sense of threat in his wake. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, but Elias knew the fight was just beginning. He had a feeling that Caleb wasn't just a random relative. The man's words, the cold cruelty in his eyes, all pointed to a deeper, more sinister truth. That night Elias sat with Lucas in his living room, a lantern casting a soft glow. He knew he had to get the full story from the boy. The threat of Caleb was real, and he needed to understand what he was fighting against. "Who is he, Lucas?" Elias asked, his voice gentle. Lucas, who had been staring into the fire, finally looked up. His eyes were full of a deep-seated sadness and fear. He's not my uncle. He's my mother's stepbrother. He's a bad man." He then began to tell his story, his voice a whisper, the words coming in a rush. Lucas's mother, a quiet and kind woman, had been a botanist, a rare trade for a woman in that era. She had learned from her Apache ancestors the healing properties of desert plants. Caleb, a ruthless and greedy man, had discovered her secret. He wasn't a healer, he was a businessman. He wanted to force Lucas's mother to sell her knowledge, to create snake oil remedies that he could peddle to unsuspecting people for a profit. When she refused, he had threatened her, her life, and her boys. He wanted to make her a slave to his greed, Lucas said, his voice trembling. She ran away. We ran. For years we were on the move. She was always looking over her shoulder. The fever. It took her in the end. It was the same fever as Thomas's. But there was no one to help her, no one to get the root. Elias's heart ached for the boy, the weight of his past, the constant fear, the loss of his mother. It was all too much for such a small frame. He also understood Caleb's true motivation. He didn't want Lucas out of some sense of familial duty. He wanted to force the boy to give up his mother's secrets, the very knowledge that had saved Thomas. "He thinks I have her book," Lucas said, his eyes filled with a new fear. "The book with all the plants, the remedies. He wants to sell it, to make money. He'll hurt me. He'll do anything to get it." Elias's jaw tightened. He had a new purpose. He wasn't just protecting a boy. He was protecting a legacy, a piece of knowledge that was meant to heal, not to be exploited. "Where is the book?" he asked. Lucas hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, worn leather journal, its pages brittle with age. It was full of hand-drawn illustrations of plants and meticulous notes in a woman's graceful script. It was a treasure, a testament to his mother's wisdom, and a target for a greedy man. Elias took the book, his hand gentle. "It's safe here, son," he said, his voice a promise. "I won't let him get it. Or you." The next few days were a nervous waiting game. The town was on high alert, its people watching the road with a new kind of vigilance. Elias sent a rider to the nearest large town to request a marshal, but he knew it would be days before help arrived, if it came at all. Caleb was a ghost. He had no fixed address, no paper trail. He was a man of the shadows, and they were the only ones he would be following. Sure enough, a few days later, just as dusk was settling over Harmony Creek, Caleb returned. He didn't ride in this time. He was a silent figure on the edge of town, watching, waiting. Elias spotted him first, a lone shadow against the horizon. He knew the confrontation was inevitable. Elias had already prepared. He had moved Thomas and Lucas to the back room of his office, a secure location with a barred window. He had given Lucas a small Derringer pistol, a last resort in case things went wrong. The boy, with a grim determination, had accepted it. He was a child no longer. He was a survivor. Caleb's method of attack was not a frontal assault. He was a predator, not a soldier. He would use the darkness to his advantage. As the night deepened, the town went quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by a tense silence. The only sound was the wind, a lonely, mournful whistle. Elias saw him first at the general store, a dark figure slipping through the alleyway. He was trying to get to the back of the office. He was a phantom, moving with a practiced ease that spoke of years of running and hiding. Elias knew he couldn't let him get close. He had to face him in the open. Elias stepped out from his office, his gun in his hand, his voice a low command. "Caleb, don't take another step." Caleb emerged from the shadows, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. "Give me the boy, Sheriff. And the book. There's no reason for anyone to get hurt." "The boy is under my protection," Elias said, his voice firm, "and the book is not for sale." "You're a fool," Caleb hissed. "That knowledge is worth a fortune." The boy's mother was a fool, too. She gave up a fortune for some pathetic ideal. Elias knew the truth of his words. This wasn't just about money. It was about two opposing ideologies. Caleb represented greed, the corruption of knowledge for profit. Elias, and by extension Lucas, represented the preservation of wisdom for the good of others. It was a clash of two worlds, the old and the new, the corrupt and the pure. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Caleb, a man of quick, deadly reflexes, drew his gun in a flash. Elias, however, was a step ahead. He had faced down countless gunslingers, and his movements were born of instinct and experience. A shot rang out, a sharp crack in the night. It hit the ground near Elias's feet, kicking up a puff of dust. Elias returned fire, his bullet aimed at Caleb's gun hand. It was a dangerous shot, a gamble, but he didn't want to kill the man. He wanted to disable him, to end the threat, without a life being taken. His shot was a little high, grazing Caleb's shoulder. Caleb cried out, a sound of pain and rage. He was not just a hunter. He was an injured animal, more dangerous than ever. The fight moved into the alleyway, a series of quick, brutal movements. They grappled, their bodies a blur of motion in the dim light. Elias, older and wearier, had the advantage of a clear conscience. Caleb was driven by greed, a force that could make a man strong, but also reckless. Caleb lunged, his knife in his hand, a glint of steel in the moonlight. Elias dodged, the knife missing his chest by an inch. Suddenly, a loud noise from the back of the office. Caleb had been in contact with someone else. A second figure, a large, burly man, emerged from the shadows. Elias was outnumbered. Caleb, with a new surge of strength, shoved Elias against the wall. "The book!" he shouted to his accomplice. "Get the book!" Elias, his head ringing from the impact, saw the second man heading for the back of the office where Thomas and Lucas were. A cold dread, a far worse feeling than the one he'd felt when Thomas was sick, settled in his stomach. He had failed. He had put the boys in danger. But then he saw a flash of movement from the back door. It was Lucas. He was holding the small Derringer pistol. The second man, too focused on the door, didn't see him. Lucas, his face pale but determined, raised the gun. He didn't fire. He fired into the air, a loud, attention-grabbing shot that made the man stop in his tracks. The sound echoed through the silent town, a signal of distress. Jedediah, the blacksmith, was the first to arrive. He was followed by a few other townspeople, all armed, all ready to defend their own. They formed a circle around the two men, their faces grim and determined. Caleb looked at the crowd, his eyes filled with a new kind of fury. He was cornered, his plan in ruins. Caleb, a man who had been a predator all his life, was now the prey. He looked at the faces in the crowd, the blacksmith, the store owner, the bartender. They were not lawmen, but they were a community, and their collective resolve was a force greater than any gun. He knew he couldn't win. He threw his gun to the ground, a gesture of defeat. His accomplice did the same. Elias, bruised and aching, walked over to Caleb, his gaze steady. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice a low, final command. He looked at the man, a lifetime of anger and vengeance compressed into a single defeated figure. The man who had terrorized a mother and her child, the man who had tried to exploit knowledge for greed, was finally brought to justice. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in a soft, forgiving grey, Elias saw Lucas standing at the back of the office, his small form trembling. He had saved them. He had faced his fear and had acted with a courage that was far beyond his years. Elias walked over to him, his hand gentle on the boy's shoulder. "You did good, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lucas looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears, a release of all the fear and pain he had been carrying for so long. "I'm not an orphan anymore," he said, his voice a choked whisper. Elias hugged him tightly. "No, you're not," he said, his voice a promise. "You're my son." The town, which had been silent during the conflict, now came alive. People came out of their homes, their faces filled with relief. They had witnessed not just a gunfight, but a battle for the soul of their community. They had seen a father and a son bound not by blood, but by a shared trial and a profound gratitude. In the weeks that followed, life in Harmony Creek began to return to normal, but it was a new normal. Lucas was no longer an outsider. He was a part of the community. The townspeople, who had once seen him as a beggar, now saw him as a hero. He and Thomas were inseparable, their friendship a testament to their shared experience. They spent their days exploring the desert, their laughter echoing through the canyons. Lucas, now with the security of a home and a family, began to heal. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a boy, full of life and laughter. Caleb and his accomplice were taken to a larger jail, where they would be put on trial for their crimes. Elias, however, knew that the real justice had already been served. Caleb had lost what he valued most, the freedom to exploit and the knowledge he so desperately craved. The book, Lucas's mother's legacy, was now a protected treasure, a symbol of a different kind of strength, one not born of violence, but of compassion and wisdom. One evening, as the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in a blaze of purple and gold, Elias sat with Thomas and Lucas on the porch of his home. They watched the sky, a silent, comfortable trio. "The desert fever," Thomas said, his voice full of a new kind of respect. "I never knew it could be stopped." "My ma said it's a test," Lucas said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The desert doesn't give you anything for free, but it hides a secret for those who are willing to look. It's not just about finding the right route, it's about not giving up hope, even when it feels like there's nothing left." Elias looked at Lucas, his heart full. He had learned a profound lesson. He, the lawman, the protector of the town, had been saved by a beggar boy and his mother's legacy. He had learned that true strength wasn't in a badge or a gun, but in a small act of kindness, a desperate journey, and the courage to trust in something he couldn't see. He had saved a life, and in doing so, he had saved his own. The dusty streets of Harmony Creek, once a place of quiet despair, now felt like home. The shadow was gone, replaced by the promise of a new tomorrow, a future where hope, like the rare purple flowers in the desert, could bloom even in the harshest of lands.